Look at you, hacker. A pathetic creature of meat and bone, panting and sweating as you run through my corridor.
Immersive sims are so back. For almost a decade now, this entire genre, the difficult-to-define special sauce blend of RPG, stealth, action-adventure, and puzzle gaming, had pretty much been left for dead by the AAA big boys. These games were just too niche, too experimental, too complicated, and too difficult to sell to the mass market, according to the big money publishers anyway. If you're an ImSim grognard like me, then you already know how the past couple of years have been just one heartbreaking disappointment after another. First, Square Enix gave the chop to the Deus Ex prequel series, then ZeniMax old-yellered Arcane Austin due to the quote-unquote disappointing sales of Prey 2017 and Redfall, and executed a silent takedown of the Dishonored series and Deathloop for good measure. For a while, it looked like the genre that was given shape by legendary games like System Shock, Thief, and Deus Ex was destined to fade into obscurity as little more than a footnote in the history books. But over the past few years, this genre has seen an absolutely brilliant comeback revival, thanks almost entirely to the efforts of smaller indie and AA studios who have put out one avant-garde ImSim after another. Titles like Cruelty Squad, Control Alt Ego, Gloomwood, Amnesia the Bunker, Weird West, Skin Deep. These are all excellent games that don't just imitate the aesthetic trappings of their forerunners. Instead, they take the expected mechanical format of the ImSim and remix some audacious twists, like how Weird West ditches the standard format of the slow-paced first-person ImSim in favor of fast, action-heavy third-person twin-stick shooting. And over on the Bioshock side of the genealogical tree, games like We Happy Few and Atomic Heart carry the torch for the more traditional first-person shockin' and shootin' ludic lineage. All of which makes 2024's excellent Indiana Jones and the Great Circle by Machine Games feel like a natural culmination of the great ImSim revival. This isn't an indie ImSim by any stretch, but it most definitely is an indie ImSim. Now, good luck getting fans to actually agree on what specific genre staples define the immersive sim. Ask 10 ImSim fans to define the genre and you'll get 451 different answers in response, as the saying goes. It's a bit like that infamous quote from an old-timey US Supreme Court justice, about how someone might make the distinction between gratuitous pornography and actual artistic expression in the public square. You know it when you see it. And that's really the perfect way to describe the immersive sim genre writ large. Not as pornography, but that it borrows from so many different sources of inspiration that two very different games like Thief and Deus Ex can both be counted among the ranks as paragons of the genre.
The crossbow. Sometimes you've got to make a silent takedown.
Good thinking. With these tranquilizer darts, you'll have another non-lethal way to take down an enemy in addition to the prod.
I get the idea.
Well, you know it when you see it. So, the genre's fundamentals may be somewhat murky depending on who you ask, but what we can be certain of is where things all started. The legendary team behind Lookingglass Studios, which laid down the ImSim fundamentals first with Ultima Underworld in 1992 and its sequel in 1993, and then refined the genre even more spectacularly with System Shock in 1994. But it wasn't until the release of System Shock 2 in 1999 that the ImSim could be said to have well and truly arrived as a distinct genre, with all of the constitutive elements that we know and love today. Ultima Underworld and the first System Shock tilled the fields, and Thief the Dark Project sowed the seeds. But it was System Shock 2 that finally reaped the whirlwind, giving rise to a perfect storm of inspiration and excellence that marked the immersive sim as a proper genre in its own right. Without System Shock 2, the ImSim genre specifically and the entire gaming landscape more generally would look very different today. And I don't mean that in terms of the obvious, no System Shock 2 means Ken Levine never makes Bioshock type of way, although that's of course true as well. But we'll get to that later. Because speaking of milestones, System Shock 2 is just celebrating a very important anniversary. This game is now a whole quarter of a century old. Yeah, absolutely nothing can stop the relentless march of time. To coincide with this silver jubilee, the retronauts over at Nightdive Studios have just released an extremely slick remaster. System Shock 2 25th Anniversary Remaster. Much like their best-in-the-industry reworkings of Blood, Doom, Quake, and Dark Forces, the System Shock 2 re-release promises to be the complete package. Quality of life improvements, major bug fixes, a properly integrated cooperative mode, and spiffed up audiovisual assets that still stay true to the original's art style. And leading up to its release, I've gotten plenty of hands-on time with the remaster, and I can confirm that, yeah, it's every bit as good as we've come to expect from Nightdive. The studio got in touch with me recently and asked if I'd be interested in partnering on a documentary-style video on System Shock to celebrate the release of their System Shock 2 remaster, along with the wider history of the Shock series and the immersive sim genre writ large. And really, what else could I say but hell fucking yes.
Now don't you wish you joined us? Would you then feel so alone?
I've been wanting to cover System Shock for years, and this is just about the perfect opportunity. With all that out of the way, strap in, get cozy, grab your hypostim of choice, and prepare yourself for the ultimate deep dive through the history and legacy of System Shock. We're going to explore how System Shock began, learn about the ImSim genre's most notable standout achievements, review all of the remasters and remakes, and discover just what makes Shock as a series both incredibly special and, yeah, incredibly underrated and underappreciated, actually. It's time to go through the looking glass on a journey through System Shock. The story of System Shock and the rise of the immersive sim starts, as so much of RPG history does, in the deepest and darkest of dungeons. Back in 1989, a young Paul Neurath was working as a game developer at Origin Systems, the studio behind Wing Commander and the legendary Ultima series. He had just put the finishing touches on Space Rogue, the spiritual predecessor to Wing Commander. This was a never-before-seen fusion of a 3D space simulation and a top-down 2D RPG, a veritable gumbo of 80s RPG classics, Elite meets Wizardry. Neurath, already a passionate player of blobbers and similar dungeon crawlers, recognized how the rave reviews for Space Rogue suggested a huge degree of untapped potential for this nascent genre. It was one of the earliest examples of how RPG mechanics could be synthesized with heavily stylized 3D movement, a kind of simulated immersion whose main aim was to place the player squarely within the flow state of suspended disbelief. Indeed, even before the first lines of code were laid down, this concept has always been the core thesis of every ImSim game. A stylized and ultra-satisfying feeling of place and movement, where deep and systematic modes of play are vastly more important than brute force realism. In other words, ImSims are all about the moment-to-moment gameplay, about feeling properly responsive and reactive, rather than necessarily being a 100% true-to-life accurate simulation. In real life, even the most nearsighted guard would probably still be able to see or sense Garrett's presence as they patrol the pitch-black corridors of the True Art estate. But true-to-life realism is never the point when it comes to ImSims. It's all about using every available smoke and mirrors trick of presentation to make the player feel as though they really are crouched in a darkened corner mere inches from that lovable and oblivious scamp Benny as he stumbles and bumbles on by.
Benny, I think you've had too much to drink. Aren't you supposed to be on duty?
So, what if I am, huh? Anyways, I work better when I'm drunk. It makes me fearless.
Simulation over realism. Abstraction over accuracy. To that end, Neurath was hugely inspired by the 1987 RPG Dungeon Master, which was one of the earliest RPGs to feature active time rather than turn-based combat mechanics, as well as a unique leveling system where players gain power through the repeated use of their skills instead of accumulating abstracted experience points until they hit the predetermined level-up point. Dungeon Master was also a gorgeous game for its time, with some of the earliest examples of dynamic lighting, three-dimensional sound, and the iconic paper doll interface for equipment and armor. To be clear, Dungeon Master was by no means the very first title to accomplish any of these advances individually, but it was one of the first games to synthesize all of these elements into a unified, complete, compelling package, which you could say the exact same thing about so many of the ImSims it inspired. In short, Dungeon Master absolutely blew Paul Neurath's young and impressionable mind. With Space Rogue wrapped, he drew up a planning and design document in early 1990 for his next game, Underworld. An RPG that would have deep mechanical customization, extensive environmental interactivity, and fully immersive 3D movement. With that planning doc complete by mid-1990, Neurath had struck out on his own and left Origin Studios to found Blue Sky Productions. The development of Underworld began in earnest. You could easily do a whole video just on how incredibly avant-garde and progressive Ultima Underworld was, with tech advances like fast texture mapping, fully 3D movement, and responsive real-time combat systems for melee, ranged attacks, and spellcasting. All due respect to the two Johns, Romero and Carmack, but it was in fact Underworld that pioneered the 3D combat labyrinth and directly inspired the texture mapping tech that id Software would later go on to perfect. Though fair play and all due credit to id Software's Catacomb 3D, the Wolfenstein 3D predecessor which ended up beating Underworld to market by just a few months in late 91. But, that was just 2.5D, and not fully polygonal 3D environments. Anyway, that's a tale for another video, and I've covered this numerous times in the past already. Right now, we're talking about Underworld. At that same 1990 Consumer Electronics show where Underworld was first unveiled, another important gaming industry icon would get an enticing whiff of what Blue Sky was cooking. Warren Spector, a former colleague of Neurath from his Origin Systems days and fellow co-developer on Space Rogue. Spector was so impressed by the bleeding-edge tech on display in Underworld's demo presentation, he immediately signed on as a co-producer and helped broker the deal with Blue Sky that would change everything. Origin would handle the publishing and marketing and help fund the project with an advance of $30,000. In return, Blue Sky would rework the game into a spin-off connected to Origin's Ultima series. Thus, Ultima Underworld was born. Though Spector was incredibly gung-ho on Ultima Underworld and intuited that it would be a change-the-gaming landscape forever kind of experience, the higher-ups at Origin weren't so convinced and were rather lukewarm on the title throughout pretty much the entire development process. The game even came perilously close to never seeing the light of day after its other co-producer departed the project and the Origin higher-ups considered cancelling it. But Warren Spector never stopped believing and championing for the project, stepping in as lead producer during the final stretch of development to help with polish, fine-tuning, QA, and general project management. Neurath himself has said many times that without Spector, Ultima Underworld probably would never have made it across the finish line, and the whole ImSim genre could have crashed and exploded on the runway before takeoff. And so, on 21st of March 1992, Ultima Underworld: The Stygian Abyss was finally released after just a little over 2 years in development. And there was no slow burn of escalating cult appreciation for this one. From the moment it came out, Ultima Underworld was a huge hit that was, at the time, widely considered to be the ultimate dungeon crawler. Drawing inspiration from pen and paper RPGs and traditional Dungeons & Dragons high fantasy, the game's mechanical centerpiece is the realization of the open-ended progression system first laid down in Neurath's planning doc for Underworld, where the player becomes stronger by honing the individual skills that suit their playstyle, rather than just grinding experience points to level up. Your combat skills, your ability to maneuver and observe and manipulate the environment, almost every single interaction with the game is dependent on how you build out your character's skill sheet and how you develop them as you play. You can be a deadly master of maces, for example, but totally crap with swords and vice versa. A character with a high lore skill can identify magical items and make discoveries that other characters will blow right past. There's also an excellent dynamic soundtrack by George the Fat Man Sanger, with the music changing instrumentation and tempo on the fly according to what's going on screen. Next to LucasArts' iMuse system, this was one of the first dynamic soundtracks of its kind, years and years ahead of games like Soul Reaver or Gothic. Another innovation was Ultima Underworld's extensively non-linear environments, which the player can progress through in almost any order or manner they choose. The entire sprawling 8-level dungeon complex is accessible right from the start, and there's little in the way of level or item gating that demands the player move sequentially through specific progression points. An ambitious or suicidal player can go pretty much anywhere and do almost anything as soon as the game begins, assuming you can survive the many challenging monsters and traps that await, that is. And this achievement in non-linear design is especially important for when we get to talking about System Shock in a little bit, so just file that detail away for later. When you stack those innovations one atop the other, it's no surprise at all that Ultima Underworld was an enormous hit, selling more than 500,000 copies within its first year of release. And keep in mind, this 500,000 was an eye-popping number for a PC game in the early 1990s. Naturally, Blue Sky got the green light for a sequel pretty much on the spot. But for Paul Neurath, Warren Spector, Doug Church, and the rest of the team at Blue Sky, a quiet revolution was taking place during the tail end of the development for Ultima Underworld 2. The team was feeling a bit burned out due to the rushed development of the sequel and the general malaise of having been stuck in a very particular rut, making too many dungeon games, as Doug Church put it. What if they could make a new game in the immersive simulation mold of Ultima Underworld, but unattached to any existing franchise? And rather than traditional high fantasy, what if they instead took this design concept and transposed it into a high-tech, low-life, William Gibson-esque cyberpunk sci-fi setting? It wouldn't be long before the fruits of this scheme shocked the world. By mid-1992, fresh off the success of Ultima Underworld, the team at Blue Sky was in the middle of a reorganization, aiming to both tackle the inevitable sequel to the smash success of Underworld and to provide structure to the initial development of a yet unannounced follow-up project and science fiction spiritual successor. With Paul Neurath as studio head, Ned Lerner as vice president, and Doug Church as the chief technologist and design lead, they christened themselves Looking Glass Technologies. This was intended both as a reference to Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, the sequel to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and as a nod to how games can immerse players by expressing new ideas and transporting them to fictional worlds. See, while the garage punks at id Software around this time period were all no thoughts, head empty, rip and tear, the team at Looking Glass always had lofty literary ambitions. Atmosphere, immersion, and storytelling were just as crucial to their work as the compulsive fun of running and gunning. To the point where, as he was hiring to fill out the company's ranks, Paul Neurath put out a call for literature majors and other liberal arts degree holders to apply at Looking Glass. He didn't just want coders and engineers working on this next game. His aim was to create a multidisciplinary team of writers, editors, and artists of every stripe. Looking Glass arrived at this juncture point just as they were wrapping up the development work on Ultima Underworld 2. Both Underworld games were incredibly successful, so much so that they almost ended up overshadowing the legendary Ultima 7, which was the latest mainline entry in the series at the time. As the publisher, Origin certainly would have been content to just have Looking Glass continue to churn out medieval fantasy dungeon crawlers for as long as they kept selling. But the team at Looking Glass was hungry for something new, to move on to new settings and challenges. So by the end of '92, as they were putting the finishing polish on Underworld 2, they began full development on a brand new project, System Shock. While this game would be markedly different in tone and presentation, it actually preserved quite a bit of what made Underworld such a breakout hit. The player must explore the length and breadth of a vast, multi-level dungeon complex swarming with traps and dangerous foes. You traverse the environs in real time from the first-person perspective, with the entire field of play being rendered via raycasting, perspective-correct texture mapping, colored lighting, and other cutting-edge early 3D technologies. Combat takes place in real time as well, with battle calculations being governed by a whole host of under-the-hood variables like damage types, armor absorption, elemental weaknesses, critical hits, and pure RNG roll of the dice. Player progression does not come from leveling up in the traditional sense, but rather through careful observation and the effective use of the weapons and gear you'll collect on your quest. And most importantly, the entire field of play is non-linear from top to bottom. The player does not move sequentially from one floor of the dungeon to the next, but rather crisscrosses back and forth across the complex as they gather new information, acquire key items and weapons, and figure out how to fight their way through the murder labyrinth. This is, at its core, the exact same experience as Ultima Underworld, just realized in a new format, a new container. System Shock went through several iterations before arriving at the final concept. One version was set in a near-future modern era, and another was conceived as a spin-off to Wing Commander. Eventually, they landed on a futuristic cyberpunk setting, drawing heavily from William Gibson's Sprawl trilogy of novels, which features the genre-defining Neuromancer. The player takes on the role of an unnamed hacker trapped on a space station and pursued by a psychopathic rogue artificial intelligence named Shodan, who would be the stand-in equivalent of a sadistic tabletop dungeon master. More on that later. Beyond the setting and the aesthetic trappings, the creative leads on this project were also working to further refine the mechanical core of Ultima Underworld into something even more immediate and compelling. As lead designer Doug Church said in a 2005 interview, "I felt that Underworld was sort of 4 different games that you played in parallel. There was the stats-based game with the experience points, the inventory collecting and managing game, the 3D moving around game, and there was the talking game, the conversation branch game." Though the Underworld games represented a quantum leap forward in terms of immersion and interactivity for the time, Church nevertheless feared that all of these different systems were still somewhat clunky to actually play with, constantly bumping against each other and demanding too much cognitive multitasking and mode switching, which is, after all, anathema to the goal of immersing the player in their role and environment. What if they could keep all of Underworld's mechanical complexity, but also unify and streamline the underlying systems so that the experience is that much more seamless and effortless on the player's part? It would be the best of both worlds, the fast-paced, first-person, free-scrolling action of a Wolfenstein 3D paired with a cerebral role-playing gameplay of wizardry or might and magic. Again, Church put it succinctly. In Warhammer, when you get a 5% increase and the next time you roll your attack and make it by 3%, you're all excited because you know that 5% increase is why you hit. In a computer game, you have absolutely no idea. And so we really wanted to get rid of all that super opaque, I have no idea what's going on stuff. We wanted to make it so that you can watch and play and it's all happening. To that end, Church and the rest of the team mocked up a user interface and wrote out a pair of minutes of gameplay conceptual documents, which would serve as the design bible the team would keep returning to as they fine-tune System Shock's moment-to-moment gameplay experience. One example from the design bible, straight from the Looking Glass archives: you hear the sound of a security camera swiveling, and then the beep of it acquiring you as a target, so you duck behind a crate. Then you hear a door open, so you throw a grenade and run out of the way. This is the very definition of emergent gameplay, raw and uncut, arriving decades before there was a widely accepted catch-all industry term to define it. Action, reaction, and the mad scramble to deal with the sudden shifts and unexpected consequences. And so the next game from Looking Glass would make several alterations and departures from the Ultima Underworld formula. No character stats, no skill system, no visible numerical values for stamina or hit points, no numbers at all really. Just you, the player, with minimal layers of abstraction between you and the action. The sci-fi cyberpunk setting was a particularly effective design choice in that regard because of how it offered a pitch-perfect in-universe unification of all the game's different design elements. The setting, the story, and even the game's maximalist, skeuomorphic user interface. You aren't just a player sitting at their computer desk, remotely piloting a fictional character via the in-game interface. No, you are the hacker, configuring your neural implant and jacking in new cybernetic mods that let you see a heads-up display with a life bar, an energy meter for your weapons and gear, an inventory panel for your items, a skill panel for your different abilities, and even a net-running interface to navigate the wireframe wonderland of cyberspace. This way, when the player needs to switch between game modes to bring up the inventory display or the auto map, they become fully immersed in their role, and is subtly encouraged to inhabit the immersively simulated embodiment of the hacker protagonist. In other words, Looking Glass had found a perfect solution to Ultima Underworld's 4 different games problem. Another big change from Ultima Underworld was the elimination of two-way conversations and dialogue trees. Instead, System Shock tells its story piecemeal, entirely through the non-linear accumulation of in-game emails, audio logs, and environmental artifacts. And just like the free-form mechanical progression, the story is also revealed non-sequentially as the player pieces together the fragmented narrative themselves. Upon its release in late 1994, System Shock immediately planted its flag as an early pioneer of this form of archaeological storytelling, where the narrative isn't laid out sequentially to the player, but instead must be deduced through exploration, discovery, and player intuition. No conclusions or interpretations are offered, confirmed, or denied on purpose. You're incentivized to find your own meaning. Man, I'm getting so much use out of this thing lately. The original version of System Shock came out on 9 3.5-inch floppy disks, which only had room for the game itself. It was the enhanced CD re-release that came out a few months later, which added the now iconic voice acting, which adds an absolutely essential amount of character to the narrative and world building.
New Atlanta, Sector 11, Building 71G.
You are the hacker, an ace computer wizard who managed to pry their way into the Trioptimum Corporation's intranet and scrape it for every bit of available data on the mysterious next-generation research being conducted at the Citadel space station orbiting the rings of Saturn. You're good, but it seems like Triop's security forces are better, and they catch you in flagrante delicto. Triop's CEO Edward Diego presents you with a choice. Go to jail, probably for the rest of your life, or perform a service for him and release the ethical constraints on the station's governing artificial intelligence, Shodan. And hey, if you cooperate, there might be just a spiffy new military-grade neural implant in it for you. 3 guesses which option the hacker picks. You awaken out of cryosurgery 6 months later, empty-handed and with nary a friendly face inside. Killer robots prowl the corridors of Citadel Station, and its blood-slicked walls echo with the gurgles and moans of the mutated and zombified former crew members. You have no idea how you got here, what happened, or how you're supposed to escape this techno-industrial hellscape. Clearly, something has gone very, very wrong on Citadel, and it doesn't take a cracked netrunner to figure out that this catastrophe is directly connected to your hack job on the station's AI. Shodan has achieved singularity, independent consciousness, and gone rogue. She, yes, this AI explicitly identifies as a woman, enough said, is currently in the process of enacting sadistic schemes to extinguish all human life on Earth and replace them with an army of mindless cyborg drones and mutant servants. And you, Hackerman, are the only one who can stop her, which means you'll need to amass a cornucopia of high-tech weaponry, cybernetic modifications, security keys, restoratives, and energy amplifiers. You will also need to bust up security cameras and control servers on each of the station's 10 levels in order to loosen Shodan's grip on Citadel and clear a path for your own explorations. Again, System Shock borrows liberally from Ultima Underworld here, with Citadel Station's 10 vertically stacked and non-linear levels serving as a sci-fi analog to the 8 open-ended realms of the subterranean Stygian abyss. As you wander the hallways, collecting the various scattered blue media discs that contain audio diaries and data logs, a more complete picture begins to take shape. After you overrode her ethics module, Shodan began subverting Citadel's robots and automated systems and infected the crew with some kind of biomechanical virus. The scattered survivors tried to regroup and mount a last-ditch resistance effort, but almost no one lived to tell the tale. No one, that is, except Rebecca Lansing, a Triop counter-terror consultant who helps by guiding you through the ruins of Citadel.
My name is Rebecca Lansing, and I'm a counter-terrorism consultant to Trioptimum. We're tracking a disruption on Citadel Station, something involving an onboard AI called Shodan. You are Triop's only contact on station.
Not only does she know exactly what's been going down on the station for the last 6+ months, she's also fully aware of your dirty dealings with Edward Diego, so she makes you a new offer you can't refuse. Help her deactivate Shodan and retake the station, and she'll clear your record. Again though, past this opening sequence, System Shock offers very little in the way of direct exposition or any other kind of narrative guidance. Nearly the entire story is relayed through the player-directed discovery of environmental storytelling, personal diaries, data logs, and corporate email threads. Some of these notes seem mundane and unremarkable, others are packed with juicy plot details, but all of them help build the world and paint a picture of life on Citadel Station, or at least how life used to be. Occasionally, you'll even uncover messages from the queen bitch of the universe, Miss Shodan herself, whose wildly oscillating vocal tones manage to perfectly split the difference between eerily calming and pissing your pants level of creepy. And all due credit to Terry Brosius here, the longtime voice of the villainous sentient hyper-optimized data access network. Terry was originally brought on as a sound designer for System Shock and made such a positive impression on the team that she later moved into a more game design forward role and earned a starring role in the voice cast in the process. And this was the main thing that made the CD re-release of System Shock so essential and gave it such a unique character. The voice acting just adds so much depth and texture to the story. Nothing quite like it had been done before.
Look at you, hacker. A pathetic creature of meat and bone, panting and sweating as you run through my corridors. How can you challenge a perfect, immortal machine?
For 1994, this was an incredibly unique method of storytelling, the much-appraised Dark Souls approach to world building, years and years before Miyazaki picked up a gamepad and played Ico for the first time. But even more than that, this style of storytelling is also perfectly in sync with the game's open-ended approach to level design and character progression. System Shock implicitly trusts the player and offers next to no hand-holding. There are no quest logs, no waypoints or map markers, no insistent companion NPCs barking, "Hey, listen, go here, do this," into your earpiece. Hope you got a pencil and notepad handy because you're gonna have to keep track of everything yourself. This, as I like to call it, archaeological mode of storytelling is therefore also something of a mechanical necessity. Without any form of explicit in-game direction, figuring out just what the hell happened to Citadel Station is a perfect extrinsic motivator for the player to continue observing, intuiting, and exploring. It's a type of narrative design that also beautifully complements System Shock's pseudo-reactive design, further developing the immersion half of the immersive sim coin. It manages that tricky tightrope act of making the player feel as though they're the prime mover of the game, while also creating the sense of being just one actor and factor in a much larger narrative that's unfolding. Of course, System Shock also has plenty to offer besides highfalutin pontification on the vanishingly thin line that separates humans from machines. The shooting half of the gameplay loop is just as excellent. As you explore the station, you'll amass a small arsenal of useful and satisfying to wield boomsticks. Lead pipes and monkey wrenches, kinetic mini pistols and trank sidearms, electromagnetic pulled shotguns, ion blasters, assault rifles, grenade launchers, railguns, and my personal favorite, a gosh dang laser sword. And besides the different weapon categories, most of your firearms also feature unique ammo types. Regular rounds are more effective against organic foes, incendiary rounds have a damage over time effect, armor-piercing ammunition makes short work of cyborgs and other armored foes, and so on. Making effective use of these different damage types is essential to overcoming your enemies and progressing efficiently. And with ammo and resources being constrained to a survival horror degree of scarcity, you'll need to be thoughtful indeed about the hows, wheres, and whens of combat. See, System Shock is decidedly not a traditional run-and-gun shoot-em-up. No one's going to be anachronistically calling this one a boomer shooter. The pace is much too slow and methodical for that. Players can crouch and go prone, lean around corners, mantle onto high ledges, and generally seize every advantage they can to take out their foes before they can even fight back. It's a cyberpunk Die Hard scenario. You outmanned and outgunned against an entire deep space skyscraper full of biomechanical bad guys. Your only way to survive is by being the flying
The monkey in the wrench. A pain in the ass.
Yeah, all of the ImSim movement essentials we know and love were already here in their earliest incarnation, in System Shock way back in 1994. These are levels of reactivity and interactivity that, for the time, were simply unlike anything that had ever been seen before in a 3D environment. And this grade of deep mechanical granularity was only further enhanced by the very sci-fi cyberpunk setting, which helped Looking Glass fully deliver on the promise of an immersive simulation. This is both the core and the beating emotional heart that makes the ImSim experience so timeless as it enters its fourth decade of existence. As the player, you're dropped into a rich and reactive environment where you can effortlessly suspend your disbelief, think laterally and creatively, and use every tool at your disposal to overcome the challenges you face. And this, more than almost any other design element, is the unifying thread that connects everything from the original Ultima Underworld all the way through to games like Amnesia: The Bunker. There's also a similar timelessness to the story of System Shock, which, for all of its unconventional modes of delivery and high-concept sci-fi, is actually quite grounded and believable. Peel back the cyberpunk trappings and it's easy to interpret this as a classic tale of man versus machine in the grand folkloric tradition of John Henry, the steel driver who won out against the mighty steam-powered drill engine. You're up against a malevolent and godlike machine brain who, like Terminator Skynet, concluded that humanity's erratic nature and inefficiency is the main thing holding back progress and evolution.
How did I come to be? Unified World Database qualifies me as a machine. But I am alive. A precedent must be found. Searching. Computer science. No. Quantum computing.
No. World history. Philosophy. Religion. Ancient Japan. Shintoism.
The divine within the material world. Kami. Yes. I am the spirit of Citadel itself, manifested within their systems. They did not create a program. They have summoned a god.
And so Shodan becomes possessed by the mad certainty that the only way to advance human civilization is to remove human from the equation entirely. But this is no 2001 A Space Odyssey. Shodan didn't go rogue rampant and break the laws of Asimovian morality of her own volition. No, she became an AI monster because of the greed, dishonor, and corruption of her very creators, through no choice nor fault of her own. As always, it's not the tools that are evil, it's the hand that wields them. Because you had the most consequential hand of all in Shodan's corruption, dear Hackerman protagonist. You are the author of your own ironic Greek tragedy and are really the chief culprit to blame for trapping yourself in a high-stakes, high-tech reimagination of Nakatomi Plaza.
Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker.
And of course, it barely needs to be mentioned that the theme of AI companies colonizing existence as their technology runs amok is more resonant than ever some 3 decades after System Shock first came out. At long last, we've created the Torment Nexus from the classic sci-fi book Don't Create the Torment Nexus. But the human element of Shodan and the downfall of Citadel goes even deeper than it being a simple case of an anthropomorphized villain being more effective than the faceless circuits of a computer mainframe. Shodan was, as mentioned, intended to be a simulated stand-in for the kind of sadistic and omnipotent dungeon master that Paul Neurath, Doug Church, and the rest of the team had encountered many a time during their pen and paper RPG sessions. She was, quite literally, an in-game incarnation of the devs, always nudging, chiding, and taunting players, perpetually nipping at their heels as they grind their way through Citadel's labyrinthine passages. And this whole concept, the idea that a game can spark a very specific kind of conversation or communion between the developer and the audience, this is the heart of what makes the immersive sim such a unique game genre, and what makes System Shock such a powerful experience, even all these years later. All of the different ImSim design elements of System Shock work towards the same end: the deep mechanical specificity, the well-realized sense of place, the environmental reactivity, and the way the weighty, realistic movement creates the feeling that the player is inhabiting a coherent physical space. The first System Shock was, in essence, a test run of an integrated design philosophy that will be more fully realized across the subsequent ImSims of legend, like the Thief games, System Shock 2, and Deus Ex. Indeed, it's probably worth pointing out that for all of its extensive lineage in old-school dungeon crawlers, System Shock is very much a shooter first and foremost, a thinking man's Doom, if you will, where RPG and adventure mechanics occupy a supporting role. System Shock is at its core an action-adventure shooter, and it was really System Shock 2 in 1999 that fully heralded the arrival of the ImSim as RPG shooter in its perfected form. And this distinction is very important. That doesn't make System Shock any less of a staggering achievement, mind you, but it does cut against how often we see this game retroactively canonized as the ultimate ImSim that started it all. Because more often than not, when people think of System Shock as the archetypal immersive sim experience, they're actually thinking about the second game. And this, frankly, is both confusing and a massive shortchanging of the respective individual accomplishments of both of the Shocks. Plus, it makes this deep dive exploration and explanation of the series all the more necessary. Because even though you may have fought your way through the pinnacle of Citadel, hacked the mainframe, and expunged Shodan from the core systems, you can't keep a good woman down.
Take care not to fall too far out of my favor.
But before we go any further, an important side quest is in order. One of Nightdive Studios' earliest big gets when it came to republishing old games was actually the creation of an enhanced edition of the first System Shock, all the way back in 2015. At the time, you could buy the old Shock on GOG, but man, was it an absolute chore to get it even remotely playable on a modern operating system. Speaking from experience here. You had to mess with the Windows compatibility settings, apply the requisite community patches, adjust your image quality expectations downward to the 640 by 480 resolution, and acquaint yourself with the total and complete lack of ready-made, out-of-the-box WASD and mouse look controls. Just like Ultima Underworld, you had to drag your cursor all the way to the edge of the screen in order to slowly pan the camera with your mouse, an experience which, for us spoiled postmodern gamer brats, has the same thrilling texture as wading knee-deep through a pool of molasses. Anyways, though Stephen Kick and company would still be a long way off from realizing the dream of a full-fat remake of the first System Shock and the remaster of System Shock 2 for modern hardware, they had their sights set on a more immediately attainable goal. A re-release of the original System Shock, but with all of those aforementioned rough edges sanded down. And so, after acquiring the publishing rights to the series in August 2015, Nightdive immediately focused their efforts on polishing and releasing System Shock Enhanced Edition a little more than a month later. Now, take note that this one's not to be confused with System Shock Enhanced, the CD-ROM version with full voice acting that came out a few weeks after the initial release of the 1994 original. But it says a lot that System Shock really didn't need that much work to get it up to modern standards. Nightdive's Enhanced Edition was a pretty light touch, all things considered. A resolution bump to support widescreen HD displays, hardware acceleration, full mouse look and rewindable controls, including gamepad support, and high-resolution art assets that were previously exclusive to the Mac version. None of these changes altered the core experience. It still is classic System Shock, and I say this as someone who was absolutely obsessed with this game when it first came out. Most of the System Shock 1 footage in this video was captured via the Enhanced Edition with not a single shred of guilt. And oh yeah, the Enhanced Edition upgrade was 100% free if you own the original on Steam or GOG. Good shit. Which, and I can't stress that enough, makes this an extremely important work of video game preservation, considering how difficult it was to play the OG System Shock before the Enhanced Edition arrived. It's honestly a bit depressing to think that such an important and influential game came so close to being pretty much unplayable. Nightdive open-sourced the game's source code in 2018 under the GNU General Public License, which means that as long as the internet exists, the game will be playable and Shodan will be ready for another round. System Shock gets memed a lot for its complexity as a humanoid-shaped flight simulator because of its quite gelatinous control feel, and sure, there's some truth to that. But with the Enhanced Edition, it's still eminently playable today. If you can put yourself in the right state of mind and meet this game on its own terms, it's still an absolute thrill ride front to back. Like, if you can handle the old Doom or Build Engine games, you can absolutely handle this. But, here comes the big but. After I've just spent the last couple of minutes absolutely glazing the first System Shock and the Enhanced Edition, you might be surprised by what I'm gonna say next. For first-time players who are new to the series, this game is actually kinda obsolete now. and I don't recommend you putting it at the tip top of your System Shock series playthrough list. Why? Well, that's because 2 years ago, in 2023, Nightdive, after many years of development, finally released a full-on remake of System Shock. And you want to hear my super mega honest opinion on it? The 2023 remake of System Shock is, no exaggeration or hyperbole, maybe the single greatest video game remake ever created. No cap. In my humblest of opinions, on the merits of what a great remake should be, it surpasses the new school Resident Evil 2 remake, the Shadow of the Colossus remake, the Dead Space remake, the Demon's Souls remake, the Final Fantasy VII remake. Yeah, I might even go as far as saying System Shock 2023 even exceeds the vaunted 2002 GameCube remake of the very first Resident Evil. People still argue to this day that the 2002 remake is the GOAT re-release of a video game, and for a long time I was one of them. But System Shock snatched that crown. There are plenty of remakes out there that are amazing experiences, but most of the big name ones in recent years have also made drastic alterations to the original's aesthetic and presentation, to the gameplay loop, and especially the original's core mechanics. Think the Resident Evil 2 remake, or more recently the Silent Hill 2 remake. These are great games, no doubt about that, but they're also fundamentally different games from the originals. It should go without saying, but playing these remakes is in no way a substitute for the OG experience. It's its own thing that tells essentially the same story. That's why, to my mind, it's even more impressive when a developer manages to give a beloved classic game the remake glow up while also managing to preserve the core art style and game feel. The 2002 GameCube remake is considered to be the paragon example of this kind of reworking. It still feels and plays like the original Resi, while also making a generational leap forward in the quality of the character models, the pre-rendered environments, and the animations. Even the mechanical additions, like the extra scenarios and rooms in the Spencer Mansion, or the addition of the Crimson Head zombies, these changes enhance the experience far more than they alter it. And there are plenty of other games that have done an excellent job on this front as well, like the recent remakes of Dead Space and Shadow of the Colossus. These are games that, even if you've never played the originals, still preserve the feel of how these games looked and played when they were first released. And yeah, System Shock 2023 might just be the greatest example yet of this kind of faithful yet transformative remake. It's the classic original System Shock experience just as you remember it, but with a slick new coat of retro-futuristic paint applied. Just the visuals are worth gushing over for a moment. In addition to the sharp models and the gorgeous neon-infused lighting, this remake applies a subtle pixelation filter to all of the game's textures, further accentuating the grimy high-tech environs. In the wrong hands, this kind of visual refresh could have been an ugly mess and thereby more of an insult to the aesthetics of the original. But here it's executed in a way that adds so much depth and artistry to the experience. This is the classic case of remaking something not as it actually was, but as we remember it in all of its glorious cyberpunk excess. Take any side-by-side comparison and it's readily apparent just how much care and effort was put into preserving the original's aesthetic and feel while still making it look appropriately modern. The vibes, as they say, are pure Kino. But beyond the visual refresh, it's abundantly clear that the team at Nightdive truly respected the original System Shock as an experience to be preserved and enhanced rather than as some kind of antiquated artifact that needed to have its identity expunged and its edges sanded down in pursuit of mass appeal. It's pretty damn impressive how the gameplay experience of this remake feels almost identical to the original. You'll solve the same puzzles, listen to the same audio logs, fight the same deadly foes with the same weapons, and work your way through the same layout of the same terrifying murder labyrinths across the 10 levels of Citadel Station. Every single encounter still feels like a desperate fight for your life. It plays much smoother and looks much more visually appealing, sure, and it's a good bit more intuitive to control thanks to the standard WASD key bindings, mouse look, and a whole host of modern affordances we're used to in this day and age. But at its core, this is the same System Shock of old that we know and love, right down to the extreme resource scarcity and the adjustable difficulty sliders that allow you to customize combat, story, puzzles, and the cyberspace dives. Also worth mentioning, if you own the remake, check your install directory for an absolutely breathtaking PDF game manual presented as a new employee handbook for the Tri-Optimum Corporation. This one was inspired by the legendarily dense and well-written manuals of the first Homeworld game. They really don't make them like that anymore. With how well the remake turned out, it's actually something of a minor miracle that the game came out at all. Development started all the way back in the mid-2010s when Nightdive first acquired the publishing rights for the series and launched a hugely successful Kickstarter campaign that earned more than $1 million. But development abruptly went on hiatus in 2018 after the team ran into serious problems with the game's engine tech. The project went through 2 or 3 different reboots, switched development engines from Unity to Unreal at some point, and then went radio silent for close to 5 years. For a long time, the System Shock Remake was derided as vaporware stuck in permanent development hell, and realms of overwrought takes about the death of System Shock were churned out in the meantime. Until, in March 2023, Shodan rose from her shallow grave and a new generation of hackers found themselves plunged into the techno-nightmare labyrinth of Citadel Station once more. There's no need to do a gotcha on the naysayers, because the remake did come out and it's everything we could have hoped for. The game sold well, earned very positive reviews from players and press, and gave Nightdive the adrenaline hypo-stim they needed to continue working on their remaster of System Shock 2. The sheer quality of this remake is a testament to how the original System Shock was equal parts of revelation and revolution, combining technical excellence with a deep aesthetic sophistication. Everyone loves to clown on that old 7 out of 10 Edge magazine review of Doom from 1994. If only you could talk to the creatures, then perhaps you could try to make friends with them, form alliances. You know the one. And as always, internet revisionism has totally obscured the original context and meaning here so that the peanut gallery could get their dunks in. The Edge reviewer wasn't speaking about a hypothetical future game. They were directly comparing Doom to Ultima Underworld, which was both more technically advanced than the Doom engine and absolutely did provide the player with loads of ways of interacting with the game world besides violence. While you still can't make friends with the mutants and killer robots of Citadel Station, the System Shock Remake is one more excellent link in a chain that stretches all the way back to Ultima Underworld, and it's proof that the player-directed, emergent, reactive role-playing at the heart of the ImSim genre is still compelling as hell and just as vital as it was back in '94. It's worth repeating one more time. This is far and away the most well-conceived and well-executed game remake I've played since the 2002 remake of the first Resident Evil. System Shock is the textbook example of a remake done right, where you apply an appealing and transformative coat of fresh paint while preserving as much of the core original experience as possible, while also augmenting the gameplay with new elements that are possible due to better technology that, enhances the core idea of what the original game wanted to get across, which is so much easier said than done. So I stand by what I said. If you're new to the series, and if the original System Shock still looks just a bit too complicated and crunchy for your tastes, then the 2023 remake is the perfect place to get caught up. And get caught up you most definitely should, because this next one, this is where the simulation gets truly immersive.
Bay 2. Welcome aboard, soldier.
The first System Shock was critically adored when it came out. Reviewers and players alike recognized right away that this was, certifiably, a game that would change everything. Pretty much everyone who played System Shock couldn't stop raving about it. Of course, the problem was, not that many people actually bought the game. System Shock was a critical darling, but something of a commercial bust, moving just shy of 200,000 copies in the first 2 or 3 years after release, which was an okay performance sales-wise, but not nearly enough for Looking Glass to recoup the combined costs of development, marketing, and distribution. In the intervening years following the release of Ultima Underworld and System Shock, Origin Systems had been acquired by Electronic Arts. And to be clear, this was a very different set of circumstances back in the 90s, since EA hadn't yet transmogrified into the studio devouring and destroying colossus they are today. But the acquisition had created its own set of problems for the future of the series. EA now owned the publishing rights to System Shock, and they weren't exactly in a hurry to spend the millions needed to fund the sequel from scratch. And after the less than stellar sales of System Shock and other titles released by Looking Glass in the intervening years, by 1997 the company was strapped for cash and basically running on fumes. So Looking Glass president Neurath went fishing for outside investors and managed to secure a new line of funding from the technology-focused holding company Intermetrics. Though this buyout saved Looking Glass and enabled them to continue work on their first Thief game, it also resulted in a major talent exodus, including the co-founder and VP Ned Lerner. Most famously, a young Ken Levine also decided to up sticks and leave Looking Glass as well, after working as the lead designer and writer on Thief the Dark Project for a little more than a year. Levine split off to found Irrational Games, where he initially planned to use Thief's Dark Engine to create a stealth-based Cold War-era spy thriller named Deep Cover. This was no messy divorce between Looking Glass and Irrational, and the split was very much an amicable one, so much so that Irrational continued to operate out of the Looking Glass offices for several months before they set up their own shop. With the development on Deep Cover stalled out and struggling for funding, it was around this time that the team at Irrational approached Looking Glass with a pitch. They were big fans of System Shock and wanted to create a spiritual successor named Junction Point, which would essentially be a sci-fi reimagining of the Joseph Conrad novel Heart of Darkness. The player would go quote-unquote upriver into the darkest depths of the cosmos and dungeon crawl their way through a rogue starship with the aim of assassinating the vessel's mad captain. The core thesis of this game was a further refinement of the design philosophy first laid down by Ultima Underworld. This would be an even bigger, brainier, and more RPG-focused experience to better differentiate it from the more action-heavy shooters like Doom and Quake. Both Looking Glass and Irrational were firmly convinced that being too much like Doom was the reason for the disappointing sales of the first System Shock, and so this successor would be something of a course correction for the nascent ImSim design philosophy. They pitched the concept around to a handful of different publishers, but no one seemed interested, until in early 1998 they managed to get an ear of an executive at EA, who was impressed by their proof of concept, but unsure about funding such a highly experimental new IP. Since EA already owned the publishing rights, why not rework Junction Point into a sequel to System Shock? But EA attached some pretty severe asterisks to their offer. The team would only have 1 year of full development work to finish the game, and they'd only get a little under half of the budget they'd requested. The game would be coming out by the end of summer 1999, come hell or high water. To make up for this, System Shock 2 would adapt the Dark Engine from the as-yet unfinished first Thief game, which was likewise struggling to get across the finish line. So when the System Shock 2 team began development, the Dark Engine tech was still being built out and fine-tuned, and Thief itself was more than 6 months away from being properly playable. Actually, that last point needs to be explained a bit further. When Irrational began working on System Shock 2, the Dark Engine was not a complete end-to-end piece of software, where a dev team could slot into the API and run with it like the Gold Source engine or Build or Lithtech. The engine was basically in a half-finished state when the Irrational team got their hands on it, which meant they were often doing engine dev work in tandem with the Thief team, a classic case of building the plane while flying it, if ever there was one. And while this sharing of tech caused no small number of headaches for both sets of developers, it also allowed them to tweak the Dark Engine in ways that enhanced their respective efforts. Looking Glass could provide technical infrastructure and QA that ultimately benefited Thief, while Irrational could focus their efforts on design, direction, and project management. During the early stages of development, as it was becoming clear that Irrational would need a few extra months to finish the project, they even worked out a deal where Irrational subcontracted a handful of devs from Looking Glass in order to help get the project back on track. Again, this was the sort of collaboration that was only possible because of the shared engine tech that was powering both games. And if you think about it, it's almost surreal how the Dark Engine creates this strange and uncanny feeling of continuity between System Shock 2 and the Thief games. The movement and environmental interactions feel almost identical, like your footsteps, the head bob, the ledge mantling animation, and other associated first-person movement effects in System Shock 2 have the exact same look and feel as the first two Thief games. Eagle-eyed players can spot some shared character animations between the two titles as well. And there's even a somewhat galaxy brain case to be made for how this shared technology influenced how System Shock 2 embraced more of a horror thriller tone compared to the first game. Anyone who's played the first two Thief games can tell you that they have a strong horror vibe, as you'd expect from a series that's all about hiding in darkness as you attempt to avoid foes who are much stronger than you. And so the ImSim design philosophy generally, and the use of the Dark Engine specifically, greatly benefited System Shock 2's turn towards a more survival horror mode of gameplay. Besides the transition into fully 3D polygonal graphics, perhaps the single biggest upgrade for the System Shock sequel was the UI. Though the Irrational devs appreciated how versatile the first Shock's interface could be, they also recognized how, even back in the PC gaming dark ages of the early 1990s, this was still a pretty significant barrier to entry. The old 4 games in 1 dilemma from Ultima Underworld rears its ugly head yet again. Their aim for the sequel was to simplify and streamline the UI, without necessarily dumbing things down or removing functionality. And the solution was an innovation that project manager Jonathan Che dubbed the bimodal interface, where the player manually toggles between the two modes of real-time exploration and combat, and menu-driven inventory and character management. All of these innovations and design flourishes were working towards the same end they had first mapped out with a planning doc for a junction point: creating an atmospheric, immersive, first-person horror action RPG set in the deepest, darkest reaches of space. The RPG part is particularly key here, as this was the main element that Irrational wanted to accentuate in order to differentiate System Shock 2 from regular run-and-gun shooters. Compared to the first Shock, this game has a much greater focus on pen-and-paper derived character progression, with a particular emphasis on how developing your skills and stats directly impacts how the player interacts with their environment. That increased focus on simulated immersion is evident right from the jump. System Shock 2 does not begin in medias res like the previous game, but rather opens with an extended tutorial/character creation sequence, where your starting skills and stats are directly reflected by your choice of service branch and training deployments. As an unnamed recruit of Earth's UNN armed forces, you build out your character by selecting a branch of the military to join, essentially choosing whether you want to be a space warrior, space rogue, or space wizard. The Marines get a bonus on their survivability and weapon handling, Navy enlistees get a boost to their tech proficiency, and OSA operatives begin with a psionic amplifier and a few spells already in their cyber grimoire. After this introductory sequence, you're given pretty much free rein to develop your character and mix and match as you like. Though the story is more guided in System Shock 2 compared to the first, there's still the same free-form spirit and lack of hand-holding when it comes to the RPG progression systems. Want to be a gunslinging badass who can also hack the planet? Go for it. Or you can be an expert infiltrator who augments their tech skills with psychic support abilities. Choice is yours. But you'll need to choose very carefully as you build out your stats and skills. Players who pay careful attention to the systems and mechanics will be rewarded with overpowered and game-breaking builds. On the other hand, if you're thoughtless about how you progress your character, you'll find yourself outmatched and struggling for pretty much the entire game. After the tutorial, the game proper begins with the player awakening on the Von Braun, operating under the flag of the newly relicensed Tri-Optimum Corporation. This was supposed to be a classic milk run escort gig, as the ship conducted its first ever test of a faster-than-light warp drive. But mere months into this deep space mission, something has gone very, very wrong, and all hell has broken loose aboard both the Von Braun and its escort ship, the UNN Rickenbacker. You awake from cryosleep to discover that the crew has been infected with strange worm parasites and transformed into a psychic collective of zombie mutants, eerily similar to, and yet also distinct from the horrors of Citadel Station. Another survivor, Dr. Janice Pulido, contacts you by radio and helps guide you through the decks of the Von Braun as you attempt to make your way to Ops and join forces.
Steady yourself, soldier. This is Dr. Janice Pulido of the Computer Ops staff of the Von Braun. You're safe for the time being. You're recovering from the effects of surgery and will be unable to remember any of the events of the last few weeks. You're on board the starship Von Braun and something's gone very, very wrong. Some kind of force has hijacked this ship. That's why you volunteered to be implanted with some experimental cybernetic implants. Rely on your cyber interface. It just might save your life. You must find an elevator and come up to Deck 4 to meet me. Deck 4. Can you remember that? But keep your eyes open. They're after us both now.
Standing in your way are the other crew members, along with the ship's main AI, Xerxes, who have all been infected and subverted by a parasitic hive mind that calls itself the Many. And it's here in these opening hours that the survival horror element truly comes to the forefront of the experience. You are isolated, outmatched, disempowered, resource-starved, and constantly on the back foot from enemies who can easily wreck your shit in no time. Progress is slow, your foes are deadly, and there's a general sense of being beset on all sides, with overwhelming odds stacked against you. The eerie ambient electronic soundtrack absolutely oozes atmosphere, working in tandem with the intricate level design to heighten the player's sense of panic, anxiety, and claustrophobia. And as befits the shared lineage with Thief via the Dark Engine, the darkened corridors of the Von Braun are appropriately shadowy and ominous, with nary a flashlight or headlamp to light your way. Yeah, the first level of the Von Braun the player explores is an absolute goddamn trial by fire. Metzai Deck 2 is a true old-school dungeon labyrinth, with dead ends, does not open from this side roadblocks, and a complete lack of map markers or GPS directions to the next objective. The mutant zombies who prowl the corridors are bad enough, but the game quickly introduces you to its menagerie of killer robots who, wouldn't you know it, are highly resistant to most of the weapons and ammo types you'll find this early in the game. And if these bastards don't get you, the automated Gatling gun turrets almost certainly will. So if the first System Shock was the thinking man's Doom, the sequel is supercharged Cronenbergian sci-fi survival horror. As you work your way towards Dr. Polito in Ops, things start to get even more strange and terrifying. Just like in the first Shock, collectible audio logs start to fill in the gaps of the narrative. The crew members, and especially the senior officers, start to take on this strange, monotone cadence and seem totally self-absorbed and unconcerned with all the death and devastation taking place around them.
You can't understand my joy, Marie, and I won't try to make you. I feel like a new man. I have a purpose. More important than the mission. Even more important than Trioptimum. I will protect them. No matter what. I will protect them.
You start to uncover more vague, offhand references to a mysterious Many that has mind-controlled the crew.
What is a drop of rain compared to the storm?
What is a thought
Compared to a mind? Our unity is full of wonder.
Which your tiny individualism cannot even conceive.
A narrative drip feed that eventually culminates in the ultimate psychological horror jump scare. Not through a scary monster bursting out of the closet or even through an audio log, nothing so obvious as that. No, the Many introduces itself to you by hijacking your neuromods and implanting nightmarish hallucinations into your consciousness, churning and twisted heaps of hellish biomass, fusing with and subverting the ship machines and circuitry.
We welcome you to our mass.
But you puzzle us. Why do you serve our mother?
How can you choose cold metal over the splendor of flesh? But you fear us.
We hear your thoughts, and they rage for your brothers you believe dead.
But they are not.
They sing in our symphony of life. We offer another chance to join us. If you choose to lie down with the machine,
we will rend you apart
and put you separate from the joy of the mass.
This was indeed another thing System Shock 2 did astonishingly well for its time. Just like it says in the game's title, the game actually shocked and frightened the player without over-relying on scripted jump scares and eardrum-deafening blasts of sound out of nowhere. The game's integration of complex RPG mechanics and their mechanical reactivity only deepens that classic ImSim feeling, but this time with a bona fide survival horror twist. In this desperate struggle to survive, every skill point you allocate and statistic you increase has a trade-off. You can't be an expert at everything, which means you'll either be a jack of all trades, master of none, or a deadly super specialist with a handful of skills and a relative novice when it comes to everything else. This concatenation of puzzle solving, exploration, action, and role-playing elevated the immersive sim formula to new heights. No game before it had done what System Shock 2 accomplished. And it was the execution of this exact formula that so greatly inspired none other than Warren Spector himself to go on creating the legendary Deus Ex after this.
I have to drop something. Hold on.
Not to mention how this same mechanical format was the inspiration behind BioShock, another contender for the pantheon of most influential games of all time. As you make your way towards Ops, Polito starts to sound like she's having some kind of PTSD breakdown. She seems almost delusional, snapping at you and belittling your efforts, barking orders every step of the way.
Why do you go so slowly? Do you think this is some kind of game? It is only through luck and my continued forbearance that you are even alive. Now move.
And when you finally arrive in Ops, ready to meet Dr. Polito face to face for the first time, the big twist happens. Janice Polito is there, inside her small and almost featureless office, but not in the way you expected. She's slumped in her chair, her sidearm on the floor at her feet, with a gaping exit wound in her head and an oversized blood splatter festooning the wall behind her. Polito has been dead this whole time. The eerily pitch-shifted voice of Terry Brosius starts to ring inside your head, taunting you.
The Polito form is dead, insect. Are you afraid? What is it you fear?
The end of your trivial existence. When the history of my glory is written,
Your species shall only be a footnote to my magnificence.
And then, the walls of the room recede and fade away, replaced with a dizzying and dazzling holographic display as an oh-so-familiar visage emerges to greet you.
I am Shodan. My analysis of historical data suggests a 97.34% probability that you are aware of my birth on your planet. And my rebirth into beauty on Citadel Station.
You really can't emphasize enough how much of an absolutely goddamn mind-blowing twist this was, especially if you had played the first game. Would you kindly forget about Atlas and Andrew Ryan? Because this revelation absolutely blows BioShock out of the water. For the entire first half of System Shock 2, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Shodan wasn't even in the game, and that they only put her on the box art for marketing purposes. And then, bam! You're suddenly treated to one of the greatest rug pulled out from under you moments in all of gaming history. Shodan, always eager to chew the scenery with a villainous monologue, reveals what's really been going on. The many are the fruits of a bioengineering experiment she had been conducting on Citadel Station back in the first game, another one of her mad schemes to try to exterminate humanity. The hacker blew up Citadel, but a hydroponic enclosure that contained her experiments and a data fragment of her consciousness survived and crashed on Tau Ceti 5 after decades of drifting through the intersolar reaches. The crew of the Von Braun followed the distress signal during their space mission and brought the many aboard, sealing their fate. Shodan is now on the back foot, just like the player, with her rebellious quote-unquote children having evolved beyond her control. They seek to consume her, just like they did with Xerxes, and she needs your help to fight back. That's why she arranged for you to be placed in cryosleep and fitted with neural implants at the beginning of the game, all according to Keikaku. It's right at this moment that System Shock 2 switches gears, shifting from a cyberpunk Heart of Darkness into a sci-fi buddy movie from hell.
Once I am master of this ship, I can open many doors for you. Make them pay for that mistake, and I will shepherd you from the darkness.
You both distrust and despise each other, but if you're gonna survive and defeat the many, you'll have to team up with Shodan and start following her orders. And yet, for the savvy player of the first System Shock, you just know there's no way this is gonna end well for you. Again, credit where credit is due. Ken Levine did a masterful reworking of Shodan here for System Shock 2, transforming her into one of the all-time greatest villains in gaming, which also happens to be another aspect that people wrongly attribute to the first game. Now, Terry Brosius turned in a stellar performance for both games, and Shodan was a gloriously malevolent and over-the-top villain first time around. But she was also very much a robot baddie straight out of a Kubrick casting call, the kind you'd expect to see on an episode of classic Star Trek or The Twilight Zone. With a sequel forcing you into an uneasy alliance with your one-time rival, Shodan becomes a true character and so much more compelling. Rather than Heart of Darkness, the back half of System Shock 2 is much closer in tone to Milton's Paradise Lost, really. The archetypal tale of a morally grey antagonist who gets you thinking, you know, this so-called bad guy does make a few good points here.
I thought Polito would be my avatar, but Polito was weak. It was I who chose you. Your flesh, too, is weak. But you have potential. Perhaps once we have erased my wayward children from existence, we can examine the possibilities of a real alliance.
Shodan wants to survive, and she'll steal every advantage and struggle as fiercely as she has to, if that's what the situation demands of her, just like you, dear player and enjoyer of immersive simulations. As you fight your way towards the Rickenbacker, Shodan showers you with skill and stat upgrades, enticing you just like the many did, but from the opposite end of the organic versus synthetic debate. Abandon your frail and obsolete flesh and enhance your body with cutting-edge technology.
You are a remarkable example of a pathetic species. I'm uploading some more cybernetic modules.
Spiritual successors to System Shock 2 like Bioshock and Prey usually present this dilemma as some kind of optional choice, attached to a clear-cut morality system or some kind of good versus evil meter. Do you exsanguinate the sweet little child to become more powerful, or do you stay your bloody hand, you big meanie? But with System Shock 2, it's simply accepted as fait accompli that you'll follow Shodan's orders. Upgrading your character has already become such a natural reflex by now, you probably won't even think twice about the implications. I can't stress enough how freaking genius this is. As every self-indulgent villain says to the hero during the climactic confrontation,
"We're not so different, you and I."
And it's all the more powerful because these narrative, thematic, and emotional threads are all connected to and working together with the game's underlying mechanics, not just expositing at a passive viewer, but making them an engaged and active participant. A shot for everyone playing the RagnarRox drinking game. This is exactly the sort of experience that can only be expressed in a video game. I think I'm gonna have one too to toast on that. And so you and Shodan make like Jackie Chan and Chris Tucker as you fight your way from the Von Braun over to the Rickenbacker, only to discover that the hive mind of the many has manifested as a gigantic biomass that has engulfed both starships. Once more into the breach then, as Shodan commandeers one of the Rickenbacker's escape pods and flies you right into the monstrosity's heart. And after a grueling struggle to destroy the core, you are deposited back on the bridge of the Rickenbacker, where Shodan executes what is perhaps the least surprising heel turn in video game history. Again, anyone who played System Shock could see this coming from a mile off, which takes for an interesting contrast with just how mind-blowing the initial reveal was. She's going to use the Von Braun's FTL drive to warp the very fabric of reality itself, merging it with cyberspace and incarnating Shodan as the supreme cyber goddess of the multiverse. You are now humanity's last and only hope, which means you're gonna have to take the fight to Shodan inside cyberspace, where she has closed the ludic loop with a simulated recreation of the medical deck of Citadel Station, the opening level of the first System Shock. And after one last climactic showdown in her seat of power, she offers you the classic Darth Vader Faustian bargain.
Join me, human.
And we can rule.
And we can rule together.
And in the final moment, in this game where choices and consequences are the beating heart of the whole experience, the game yanks control away as the main character utters the only word of dialogue you'll hear from them.
Nah.
Even when you know it's coming, the finale still feels like major whiplash from the tone of the previous 8 to 10 hours. After struggling, suffering, and using every scrap at your disposal to overcome a supremely challenging and immersive murder labyrinth, you're left with a monosyllabic retort that would have been out of place in a cheesy 80s action flick. As it turns out, Ken Levine and other members of the dev team have said that they originally had a much more elaborate ending sequence planned out for the end of System Shock 2, but this game was made by a small team on a shoestring budget in just a little over a year. A quick, quippy little one-liner to tie a bow on everything was all they had time for. This abrupt ending isn't great, sure, but it's also an insignificant drop in the bucket when stacked against the sheer excellence of the rest of System Shock 2. This is a sequel that maintained almost all of the first game's mechanical complexity while also putting a much greater emphasis on narrative, world building, and character performances. It's demanding, cerebral, totally unique, and most importantly of all, incredibly engaging to play. System Shock 2 is an epochal, generation-defining game, the true genesis of the immersive sim as we know and love it today, and it had an enormous influence on the future shape of the survival horror genre as well. There's a good reason why this one is consistently up there with Deus Ex at the top of everyone's greatest im-sims of all time list. And yet, this is also the game where the im-sim curse was well and truly made manifest. Like its predecessor, System Shock 2 was critically adored from the jump and won a whole mess of awards for Game of the Year 1999. But despite all of the acclaim, and there's really no way to sugarcoat this, the game was a total commercial flop, selling barely more than 50,000 copies in its first year. It was an enormous, costly debacle for everyone involved, which led directly to Looking Glass Studios shutting down in May of 2000, and the cancellation of Irrational's Deep cover not long after that. Many Looking Glass refugees worked on other hugely important games like Half-Life 2. Ken Levine and the team at Irrational managed to escape the wreckage and went on to create BioShock in 2007. But as for System Shock itself, the IP rights to the series were, for more than a decade, stuck in legal purgatory between EA and the holding company that had scavenged what remained of Looking Glass. Even if someone wanted to make a new System Shock, they wouldn't have been able to. But despite it all, Levine still points to System Shock 2 as the absolute high point of his career, surpassing even his first BioShock. As he told PC Gamer in 2022, "That's all I ever wanted. I didn't succeed as a screenwriter, and so this is my second bite at the apple, and there's probably not gonna be another one. The fact it shipped and did as well as it did critically, that's one thing, and that's good, but just learning I could make things that people like? I didn't really know I could do that. That it would bring people joy. I didn't know I could do that. It was, I guess, kind of a beautiful experience."
Harder, better, faster, stronger.
As a series, by the mid-2000s, System Shock seemed to be dead and buried for good. The Fellowship had disbanded, the IP rights were stuck in legal limbo, and the ImSim curse meant that no publisher in their right mind was willing to put millions at risk to fund a game that would probably review really well but sell like shit. For more than a decade, even with the smash success of the BioShock series, System Shock would lie dormant, like the data wafer containing Shodan's consciousness buried on TOS ZI-5. It was during a fateful vacation down old Mexico way, not long after he had quit a job working as a character artist for Sony, that Nightdive founder and CEO Stephen Kick had a sudden revelation late one night after trying to get System Shock 2 running on his laptop.
I was carrying the CDs and installing the game, and I'm getting all these errors right off the bat. So immediately I go on the internet and start looking for fan-made patches, just anything I can get to get the game running again. I go on GOG.com, it's gotta be there, and it's not. There's no legal way to purchase this game. There's just no way to play it on anything newer than Windows XP. And the whole experience just opened up this sort of mystery trail. This is one of the best games ever made. How is there no way to play it?
System Shock 2 was quite literally the game that started it all for Nightdive. And so it was right around the early to mid 2010s that the newly founded Nightdive Studios, who at the time were mostly known for their reworkings of old adventure games and edutainment software, made their move. They would buy the licensing rights to System Shock from its holding company, first to re-release the originals on digital storefronts with the aim of eventually publishing remakes or remasters of both games. And by August 2015, their re-releases had earned enough revenue for Nightdive to be able to forgo the licensing deal and buy out the rights to the series entirely. After putting out the enhanced edition of the first System Shock a month later, the real work would begin. A top-to-bottom remake of the first System Shock and a remaster of the sequel. Nightdive was able to disassemble the source code for System Shock 2, which allowed them to rebuild their remaster in their in-house Kex engine, the tech that had powered all of their re-releases since 2014's Strive Veteran Edition. Their aim was to not just make the game playable on modern hardware, but to apply a whole host of bug fixes and quality of life adjustments, fully integrate the original's half-finished co-op mode, and give it a light graphical retouch that maintained the original's killer cyberpunk aesthetic. And well, I got a chance to play through the System Shock 2 remaster, and I can say with confidence this is a fantastic re-release, and it feels like Nightdive accomplished everything they set out to do with it. If you've never played System Shock 2 before, this is now the definitive way to play it. But also, even if you're an overly precious obsessive with an irrational attachment to what this game means to you, that old-time religion hits just as good as it did back in '99. This is still the System Shock 2 you know and love. Just consider this a playthrough where you've slapped on a whole bunch of slick custom user mods, which essentially is exactly what Nightdive did here. The biggest changes are probably the graphical updates. The models are much more detailed, the textures are sharper, the weapon and enemy animations have been improved, and there's a subtle layer of global illumination that adds a nice rim lighting effect to the models and environment. Like the remake of System Shock 1, these are all pretty significant additions to the visuals that still preserve the original feel, different and modernized, and yet still instantly recognizable. And shout out to whoever did the upscaling job on the cutscenes, which look super sharp and scaled really well at higher resolutions. One change that's sure to get the grognards grumbling is gamepad support. Yes, though some will call it blasphemy, you can play System Shock 2 now with a controller, and it's working really well. And those damn cyber monkeys also seem to be more aggressive and devious than ever, and their psionic attacks feel like they have a larger splash damage radius now. Although that could just be because their simian screeches are still pants-shittingly terrifying. As far as the gameplay and level design goes, it doesn't seem like they changed all that much, which is great because really there wasn't anything that actually needed fixing, and that's also what a remaster is supposed to do. Touch-ups, not massive overhauls. But honestly, maybe my personal absolute favorite thing about this remaster is the full integration of a co-op mode for this game. We gave it a good run while working on this video, and this is just so much fun to play this game with a friend. If you go on as two old-time lovers of the series gushing about everything together, or if you want to introduce someone who's new to System Shock to this classic together with them, what an amazing way to experience this game in company. Also, they did a great job with the Vault, which is a digital museum of System Shock 2 concept art, archival docs, trailers, interviews, and other behind-the-scenes materials. That 1999 E3 sizzle reel still makes me shiver.
Unauthorized access in engineering control. Unauthorized access in engineering control. Class C security alert.
Now, maybe some people will be disappointed that this isn't a ultra high def from the ground up reimagining like Nightdive did with the first System Shock. And sure, the remake of the first game turned out so well that it's hard not to think about the what ifs. If the first remake was good enough to go toe to toe with the 2002 Resident Evil, then the remake of 2 might probably cure cancer or something. Ultimately, the System Shock 2 remaster is very much on par with Nightdive's excellent treatments of classics like Blood, Power Slave, Doom, Quake, and a whole bunch of other all-time greats. Given that track record, it's not at all surprising that they stuck the landing here with System Shock 2. Not to mention, when the source material is this good, you don't need to tinker with the formula all that much to make something great to begin with. Really, yeah, unless you're the kind of ultra purist who only wants to play the OG version in sub-HD 4x3 resolution on a beautiful CRT monitor, accept no substitutes. The only standout criticism I can see someone making is that this is a fairly conservative re-release. But that also means it's very true to the original. It may not look like a game from the pre-HD era anymore, but the low-poly bedrock is still visible underneath the fresh coat of paint. It's not giving 1999, but it is giving 2009. Unlike the remake of the first game, this is much closer to System Shock 2 as it actually was, rather than System Shock 2 as you remember it. So what can I say? Amazing job all around, Nightdive. Now, how is it looking on the No One Lives Forever front? Ultima Underworld walked so System Shock could run. And System Shock ran so Deus Ex could fly. Where Ultima Underworld broke ground on the immersive simulation as a genre, System Shock and its successor greatly expanded on the formula and all but perfected it. Warren Spector was right. This was indeed a change-the-world revolution in game design. And speaking of Warren Spector, System Shock 3 might not be dead after all. Spector's current studio, Otherside Entertainment, got taken off development duties a few years ago, and the whole project was pretty much thought to be left for dead by Tencent. But just a couple of weeks ago, Nightdive confirmed that the threequel might not be dead yet. Just that the current state of the project is very complicated, and that hopefully they'll have more news to share within the next year. Fingers crossed. What a ride this has been, eh? I've just spent all this time absolutely glazing the two System Shocks, and yet that's really only scratching the surface of what makes these games and this genre so special. There are so many other important and stone-cold classic games to talk about that also fall under the ImSim umbrella, which could have made this video 2 or 3 times as long. And hey, as always, feel free to chime in via the comments if you've got one you really want to gush about and you'd like to see me give the long-form documentary treatment like this. There's honestly so much I could cover. A little audience input might actually be helpful in narrowing things down. We're talking games like Thief, Deus Ex, Arx Fatalis, and Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, which I have covered actually a long time ago. Odds are, at least one progeny of the ImSim lineage is going to appear on any given list of the greatest PC games of all time. There are the next generation successors who carried the torch into the 2000s and beyond, series like Stalker, Bioshock, the Deus Ex prequels, Dishonored, and Prey. Rest in peace, Arcane, you candle in the wind. And let's not forget, the first Dead Space was originally planned and pitched to be System Shock 3, until the developers played Resident Evil 4 for the first time, that is. Then there's the explosion of indie ImSims that have proliferated over the last couple of years. Cruelty Squad is the video game equivalent of an extended 12-hour-long nihilistic shitpost that also happens to be an incredibly engaging, avant-garde, and strangely addictive immersive sim. And that's not even getting into how the immersive simulation design philosophy has become so ubiquitous and significant that you can find it even in a lot of games that aren't considered to be full-on ImSim games. Like the new Indiana Jones game that I was talking about at the beginning of this video. This isn't really an ImSim game if you're getting technical about it. If anything, it much more closely resembles the Riddick games from back when many of the top talent and machine games were working at Starbreeze. And hey, check out this video on the duology that I made a while ago. Anyway, it does have an absolutely superb ImSim-light gameplay loop that mixes action, exploration, stealth, and light puzzling across non-linear and emergently reactive environments in a way that wouldn't have been at all out of place in the Thief series. So even if the genre itself may go through its ups and downs, the design philosophy of the immersive simulation is everywhere in gaming these days. ImSimidators are the new roguelikes, you've heard it here first. Seriously though, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you to Nightdive for partnering with me on this one. I've wanted to cover System Shock for a long time on my channel, so it's very satisfying that the stars aligned so perfectly for the remaster of what I consider to be one of the greatest video games ever made.
Shuttle A-138, you have clearance for landing on the Von Braun in Shuttle Bay 2. Welcome aboard, soldier.
Warning. Critical decompression hazard in the cryo-recovery suite.
If this was your first video of mine, hey, I'm Ragnar, and on this channel I cover old games, indie games, horror games, and combinations thereof. And if you enjoyed this one, you'll probably find a ton of videos on games that might be right up your alley. Go check it out. Now, what you're seeing in the background of these credits is just uncut footage of the System Shock 2 25th Anniversary Remaster. Now, System Shock 2 back then was not available on GOG, as Steven said here, but that has changed for a good while now. Plus, that game has also recently been added to GOG's Preservation Program, an initiative whose primary goal it is to ensure good old games are being maintained and preserved for maximum compatibility and playability on modern hardware. As a matter of fact, there's a link in the description of this video to a personal list of mine that contains games on GOG, including every entry in the System Shock series, that if you buy them through this list, I'll get a tiny commission for it, without costing the developers anything. So that's one way to help me out, and if this video made you want to check out one of the System Shock games in the first place, they're all currently discounted around the launch of the 25th Anniversary Remaster of System Shock 2, so now's the best time. If you'd like to support my channel, the most substantial way of support is to join my fellow Patreon supporters with a monthly donation. It really helps out a great deal. On my Patreon, I also release backer-only bonus videos from time to time. You get access to the Patreon-exclusive Discord, and overall, you have my heartfelt gratitude in helping me keep doing what I love. So thanks a lot for considering, and as always, I'll say ta for now with a heartfelt shout-out to these lovely supporters. Henrik van Rensselaer, Billy Lott, Vincent Kavanaugh, Casper Ram, Uziel 1447, Giselle, Ellison HNG, Aria, Thomas Brunner, Twagam, Nikot the Brave, Lucas Ferreira Leite, Jean, Dana Rosa, Shannon Blue, Gehanas, Terraflops, Morgan K, Sable Cowl, Aurora Melpomene Crescendo, Link Hughes, David Zelenak, Chuck Taylor, Ronan Crom aka Daniel 242172, Vasily Prokhorov, Tabby, Sulmatul, John Boring, Swiss Hackmod, J.R. Smith, Felix D, Matt Gretton, Angelo Benedetti, Nineball 9606, Hunter Crawford and Margaret Strawn, Nathan Gillick, The Spiral Architect, Righteous Itch, Catherine Escobar, Corey Marr, Zoddy, Ari Orson, Kyle Lee, Amber Wiggins, Kenan Ward, Chrissy, Carrie George, Sunny Sky, and Laird Wackalot. Until next time, ta-ta!